Story 1. Horrible. I spent the morning in court with my parents, finalizing their divorce and custody battle. I got to my dad's just in time to watch the launch. At the time, my room reflected my interest in the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, and I was angry that I had missed the school assembly to watch. Looking back, I am glad I was home. I was devastated. It was the worst day of my life, and I am reminded of that day every year. Story 2. We were all in the engineering department conference room watching it on television. I had designed and developed the fuel line vibration mounts running the length of the external tank. Nobody talked to me for about a month, until the National Aeronautics and Space Administration determined it was the leaky seals on the solid rocket booster. Story 3. I was in elementary school and it was live because of who was on that trip. The kids around me did not fully understand, but the teachers were very quiet. The television on its little stand was turned off and pushed aside. We went about our day in a more subdued way. Being a little kid in the 1980s was wild. The Challenger disaster, the Iran-Contra hearings, Chernobyl, and the attempted assassination of President Reagan. By 1989 so much had happened, and I had no idea until much later. Story 4. I was in high school. Krista McAuliffe was a teacher, so it was a big deal for students and teachers that she was going into space. It was the most traumatic event for my generation until September 11, 2001. Story 5. I was shocked and deeply saddened, but that was nothing compared to the anger I felt when the Challenger Commission revealed why the launch was authorized and the data from Morton Thiokol advising against it. I was a young engineer then, just starting my career, and I never forgot that. Story 6. I was in second grade at a Catholic school. As others have said, it was a very important moment for teachers and education, so every class in the school was watching live. Some of the teachers were nuns in the church, as was the principal, but our teacher was not. We all watched in horror as the shuttle veered out of control and exploded. Our teacher just sat at her desk, put her head in her hands, and began to cry. Many of us who could fit around her desk huddled for a group hug. The principal used the public address system to call the entire school to the church and summon the priest to lead us in prayer. Afterward, she dismissed us to class, announced she was canceling the rest of the day, and said parents were being called to pick us up. Our teacher, who was speechless on the way to the church for the prayer session, apologized to us in class while everyone waited to be picked up. She explained that adults are expected to keep their composure in certain situations, but sometimes the best thing they can do for children is to model a healthy expression of sadness. Story 7. Gut-wrenching to see the white cloud and no shuttle emerging, only the 2 rocket boosters flying uncontrollably. Story 8. I was 5, so I thought it was neat to see all the smoke and flames. The teacher rolled the television in for the launch. We all watched it explode. The classroom erupted in a chorus of wow, with a few children asking where it had gone. The teacher promptly turned the television off. I did not think anything of it until years later when I watched the Space Shuttle Columbia take off from Kennedy Space Center live with my uncle in Florida. The launch went well, and I realized I had seen a tragedy unfold and no one wanted to talk about it. Story 9. I was one of the awful kids at school. The phrase of the week was, "Know what the National Aeronautics and Space Administration stands for? Need another 7 astronauts." Story 10. I grew up a few towns over from where Krista McAuliffe taught. We had another teacher who had applied to be an astronaut for that mission. I was in 5th grade, and almost all the 5th and 6th graders stayed inside at recess to watch the launch. This was when shuttle launches were televised and were newsworthy just for launching or landing. The television was on a brown stand with wheels. There was no cable. We received the signal on a rabbit ear antenna. 35 of us counted down together. When it launched, we cheered as if the Sesame Street gang had shown up with pizza to announce a snow day and that we would all go home early. Some kids yelled, "Go, go, go!" And then it happened. It was as if everyone became mute at once. Then one sound cut through the silence. The 6th grade teacher tried to muffle it, but she broke down. That sound haunts me to this day. We did not know what to do. I do not recall children crying, but I remember looking at my classmates and wondering what was happening. One boy swore and no teacher said anything to him. We knew this was not right. The teachers left the television on for a while and then asked us to return to our classrooms. This felt worse than September 11th, because I do not recall any incident like this before. Story 11. It was a level of communal shock akin to the attacks of September 11th, 2001, if you are old enough to remember. This was at the height of the Cold War. Space represented both science and exploration, and we all felt connected. I was 9 in 4th grade. We had several units on the space shuttle, space exploration, and satellites in preparation for this launch. It was historic because it was going to be a teacher, a person just like one of our teachers in space. We were following in the path of Christopher Columbus, expanding humanity's reach. We planned to watch a live television broadcast, but the television antenna would not work in the classroom. 30 of us went to another room across the hall and sat around listening to the radio. The Space Shuttle Challenger launched. Everyone was excited and celebrating, and then questions followed. We heard people asking whether that was supposed to happen, whether it was the separation stage, and why there was a fireball. Our teachers froze and we froze. Some of us began to cry. Someone turned off the radio, and we returned to our classroom to begin a different lesson, I think as much for the teachers as for us. They went straight into denial and switched to other lesson plans. It was a communal experience of shock that happened to all of us at once. Story 12. When I was a kid, I was infatuated with space and watched every launch. It was pretty upsetting. Story 13. I was 9. We knew about the launch and were excited because a teacher was on board. They stopped the class and wheeled out the audiovisual carts so we could all watch. The prevailing reaction was confusion. We were not old or worldly enough to understand what we were seeing. Some kids asked when it was really going to launch. Some thought it was a cartoon, while Coyote was always exploding things, and this seemed similar. To be honest, it felt like watching the September 11th attacks live. Confusion at first. Story 14. I was 6 and lived near the Cape. We went on a mini field trip to watch a launch outside. I never saw another launch in person. Story 15. I was in my car on the way to work, sitting in traffic for a reason I do not remember. I was listening to the launch on the radio and looked up through the windshield to see the shuttle ascending. Then it malfunctioned. The broadcast was live, so I heard it in real time as everything exploded. Then someone honked at me. Story 16. I was a little kid and did not understand what had happened, but the television was on at home and my father was obsessed with all things space-related. I knew it was sad. Story 17. I watched this live in 8th grade science class. A kid in the back of the room let out the words "holy shit." The room fell dead quiet and stayed that way. Story 18. I was in 2nd grade. I felt sad, but being young made it less severe. We planted trees for the astronauts at our elementary school. Story 19. I felt bad. I was in elementary school. We were not watching the launch, but when the explosion happened, there was an announcement over the school public address system, and we were all stunned. After I got home, my parents were watching the news coverage of the explosion. I remember being upset and hugging my mother. Story 20. I was worried about my young children because I knew their school was going to watch it. I just wanted to get to them and comfort them. It was tragic. Story 21. I was in the 3rd grade, and we were watching it live in the school's multipurpose room. My parents had helped to get the satellite equipment and a big screen television donated, and our school was going to be one of the only public schools in California to take part in the Teacher in Space program, so everyone was pretty excited. I remember filing into the room and thinking, what if something happens to the shuttle? But I reassured myself that the shuttle was surely much more reliable than the unmanned rockets we occasionally saw blow up nearby at Vandenberg. I do not think most of us realized what had happened right away. I was watching for the solid rocket booster separation, and when the explosion happened, it was not until the camera pulled back and you could see the solid rocket boosters still firing that I really realized that something had gone very wrong. Our principal shut off the television before the announcer came back on and sent us back to our classrooms. You have to remember that we did not have a 24-hour news cycle or Wikipedia, and no one was really sure if the crew had ejection seats, as the first test launches actually did, or if the orbiter might have survived to make a landing. We all went home without knowing for sure that the crew members had died until the evening news. It was not the punch to the gut that the September 11th attacks were. We saw the explosion, but because the adults did not know what was going on and did not want to upset us, we had little information. A few students cried, and definitely a few teachers, but the full realization did not hit all at once, and it was pretty abstract for elementary school children. Story 22. I was in 5th grade. I was really into space and science. I was watching it live on television before school that morning. When I got to school, I was upset. No other kids even knew about it. Most of the teachers didn't know about it. Remember, there was no internet. If you weren't in front of a television, you didn't know. Most people were at school working. Classrooms had no televisions or computers. I was more upset that once people knew, no other kids seemed to care. Story 23. It was horrible. I was in Santa Monica buying a new refrigerator at an appliance store when the same program was playing on all the television sets. The scene felt surreal. Story 24. I remember it well. I was serving on board the United States ship Midway and watched it live on television. We all looked at each other and could not believe what we had just seen. Story 25. I was in 2nd grade and we were all watching it live. It was a big event at school, especially because a teacher was on board. I remember them turning the television off afterward and not much else. I think we, the kids, knew something was wrong but did not fully grasp the gravity of what we had witnessed. The teachers were vague, probably because they did not know what to say. Story 26. Here in Texas, it was extensively covered in the media. I'm 43, so I was pretty young, and to me it was the moment I truly understood the risks. I realized how dangerous and important the space program was. My father is big on astronomy. We went to the National Aeronautics and Space Administration in Houston when I was young. I remember him buying and displaying a silver coin as a memorial to the tragedy. Until recently, I had not connected the dots, but it was a turning point for my interest in space and the universe. People I know probably would not expect it, but I'm a huge astronomy nerd. The Challenger tragedy had a major impact on that. Story 27. My dad used to wake me up to watch shuttle launches. I loved them. I had a little toy shuttle. I would shove an oversized rubber Batman into the cargo bay to fly it. I vaguely remember the start of the explosion, or maybe that is a false memory. I am told the television was quickly turned off. Then my parents put on a recorded shuttle launch for me. I wasn't old enough to realize what had happened. My parents told me about it later. I do remember Batman flying the shuttle, though. Story 28. I was 4 months into my career as a National Aeronautics and Space Administration engineer when I saw my engineering director consoling his staff. I had not met the crew, but for quite a few of my coworkers, they were dear friends who were lost that day. At the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, there was a before and an after the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster. Those were two very different experiences. Story 29. School was canceled for snow, so I was posted up on the living room floor with my encyclopedias, space shuttle books, and model space shuttles doing space shuttle things as Peter Jennings or whoever talked about extreme temperatures and the risk to the solid rocket boosters. What I remember most about the aftermath was the realization that there was no possible rescue effort. It was just going to be a massive debris field and 7 lost souls. After a while, my parents took me with them to H&R Block to file their taxes, and I listened to coverage on amplitude modulation radio while staring out the window at the fattest, wettest snow I had ever seen. I've only ever felt that same level of detached hopelessness or despair one other time, and that was watching the towers fall on television. Story 30. It was a very cold day in Middle Tennessee, and the heating system for our school could not keep up. The temperature inside the building was in the 40s, far too cold, and we were grumbling about why they had not dismissed us to go home. Then, during English class, the public address speaker crackled to life and the vice principal said, "I am sorry to inform you that." With those words, we all assumed we were being sent home to warm up. Chairs screeched across the floor as we shoved books into our backpacks. Then the public address speaker continued. The Space Shuttle Challenger exploded shortly after launch. For a few moments we, including the teacher, discussed whether the vice principal was playing a sick prank. Deciding that this would be too far, we asked what we were supposed to do next. A few audio-visual carts with televisions had been set up in the largest classrooms, the science labs. They crammed 3 or 4 classes into each lab, with 100 or more students trying to see the replay on the news through the static on the 27-inch television. At least with our body heat, the room warmed a little. Story 31. Imagine being in 5th grade. Your teacher wheels a television in, dims the lights, and, excited to show you this incredible event, turns it on to watch September 11th unfold in real time. It was sort of like that. Story 32. I saw it on television. I am a space case and it destroyed me. I still hold my breath for 78 seconds every year on the anniversary. Story 33. How did it feel? The adults tried to pretend it didn't happen by not talking about it. Imagine something getting hyped up so much and then seeing it literally blow up in the sky. I remember the 2003 one more, only because the day it launched I was still a new crew member in the Coast Guard. We were out on the water and I was on watch. Being new, I called out everything I saw until they told me to be quiet. We were off Egmont Key coming out of Tampa Bay, so across the state. I called out, unidentified flying object 100 nautical miles in the atmosphere, or some stupid stuff like that. Anyway, it was a Saturday morning. We were heading out to do another job in the Coast Guard vessel, just listening to the radio, and we heard about the re-entry. The coxswain on the day of the launch said, "Dude, remember seeing it launch off Egmont?" Long story short, I was an adult in 2003, and we cracked terrible, dark jokes. Maybe the adults in 1986 were doing the same thing. I don't know. Story 34. At the time of the tragedy, people were united in their grief. Today, our president would have blamed transgender people or Somali people for the explosion. Story 35. It was the most shocking thing I had ever seen. But some years later, the September 11th attacks asked us to hold its beer. Story 36. I saw it happen from my front yard in Florida. I had taken a break from my job working from home to go outside and see the launch. I watched it explode but did not understand what I had seen until I went back inside and turned on the radio. Story 37. I was in 2nd grade. Our teacher wheeled in the television so we could watch it. She turned it off very quickly, and we all sat in silence for a while. I think we were sent home early. Story 38. It was horrible. I was so thrilled to see it live on television. We had the day off school for whatever reason, and I was home, age 12. The space shuttle program was so new. The launches were so exciting. And when it broke apart moments later, it did not seem real. What had I just seen? Then the newscaster started freaking out, and I began screaming and crying. That is what I remember. Story 39. I live in Canada and we were watching it live. I was young, as you can imagine, but I could still understand what was going on. I just sat there in shock. My parents were too, and my mother was covering her mouth. Story 40. Shocking, mind-numbing, and extremely sad. Story 41. I was in 4th grade. We were watching it live in our classroom. An eerie silence and disbelief filled the room. Our teacher began to cry. Story 42. It was riveting. I watched the launch in the common room of my college dormitory. We were all dumbfounded. Story 43. I was in the library at school in 4th grade. We were allowed to watch it because a teacher was present. They turned on the television quickly because I saw the actual explosion. I saw it smoking on the way up and knew something was wrong. I do not recall anyone checking whether any children were in distress, and the parents at the time were not attentive. I had nightmares for a few days, and I did not think they had all died for about a week. Story 44. Unbelievable. You did not want to believe that you had just witnessed people dying. Surely that was some trick on the television? It was the same feeling with the September 11th attacks. Story 45. Godawful was an adult with young children in the house. They had to explain the tragedy for the children's understanding. It was hard to do. Story 46. I was very young when I saw it. I told my mom, but she did not believe me. It was sad and disappointing. Story 47. I was born in 1977, so I think I was in 4th or 5th grade. It was a big deal because the teacher stepped away. When it was time, they rolled the audio-visual cart into the room, which was almost as big a deal. It meant a television program or an educational show, which was inevitably better than listening to the teacher. The entire class was riveted to the screen, and then it happened. I do not remember what happened next, not because it was traumatic, but because the teachers were good. They quickly turned off the television and diverted our attention to the next task. I am not saying it was not traumatic, but we were 9-year-olds and did not grasp the severity of the event. I have a book about the Challenger disaster upstairs, but I have not started it yet. Story 48. I was 6¼ years old and English. I was very into space. I saw it on the news, probably not live, just a report. I do not know. I thought the equivalent at the time was, wow, that's awful. I would have phrased it that way as a 6-year-old. It was 40 years ago. I was already aware of the possibility of launch failures because of previous incidents. I probably went to play. At school, we joked that the National Aeronautics and Space Administration stood for need another 7 astronauts. Then we forgot about it and moved on. Story 49. I was in 3rd grade. We all watched it live on television in our classrooms because one of the astronauts was a teacher. When it blew up, I remember turning to my friend and saying they were all dead. I felt helpless, like I had to do something but could not. They gathered us and took us to the gym and brought in the music teacher to play songs and have a sing-along. Back then, I would snuggle with my dad every night after dinner and watch the 6 o'clock news. I remember him crying when he watched the news report. I have only seen my dad cry a few times. Story 50. I was in 9th grade. It was devastating. Last week, my husband and I toured the Kennedy Space Center of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, and they had a piece of the Challenger on display. Those raw feelings came flooding back, and I almost broke into sobs. Story 51. I was at home sick during 2nd grade and watched it on television. The catastrophe I witnessed did not really register with me until I was back at school a few days later. Story 52. I am older than that. I was present at its first launch. I felt awful and found it hard to believe. Story 53. It was shocking to watch it explode because it represented the best and most high-tech aspects of America. Story 54. I was teaching a class when the school circulated a note to inform teachers about an announcement that was about to be made. We had to carry on as if nothing had happened. Story 55. It was bad. I was in high school biology class when we were taken to a nearby room with televisions and shown the footage. I remember people being silent. It was not nearly as awful as the attacks on September 11, 2001. Story 56. I was a teenager in New Zealand at the time. It was interesting but hardly a tragedy. Worse things were happening in the world. As a teenage boy, I thought explosions were exciting, and a teacher exploding seemed almost amusing. Teenage boys can be somewhat self-centered. Story 57. Surreal, like it was a Hollywood production. Then reality set in. Rest in peace. Story 58. It was traumatic. I was in elementary school and watched it live in class. Story 59. We were in the library when they wheeled in a television on an audiovisual cart so we could watch it. When it exploded, they just turned off the television and sent us back to class. It was a somber moment. Story 60. We watched it on a television set rolled into the classroom on a cart. I will never forget that day at school. Story 61. I worked for an afternoon paper. We had just started rolling the presses when it blew up. Someone yelled, "Stop the presses." I was horrified, but I knew we would have to remake the whole front section in less than an hour, so I did not get to mourn until later. Story 62. It was surreal. I was in 6th grade, and my teacher had been in the running to go, but she had to pull out because she became pregnant. The television was on in the classroom when I arrived because she had planned to watch it as class started. It exploded just after the bell rang. I do not remember anything that happened after that. Story 63. It seemed impossible. I vividly recall a newscast saying the astronauts would most likely survive until the cabin hit the ocean. I felt profoundly sad and horrified for them. Story 64. My former mother-in-law was in high school at the time. The school was fairly close to the launch site, so her class was outside watching the launch live rather than on television. It was really sad hearing her talk about it. She is a teacher now, and I always wondered whether that incident influenced her career. Story 65. I was depressed for about a year. I had just started school to work in the space program. Story 66. I watched the first space shuttle launch as a high school senior. I still cannot watch replays of the Space Shuttle Challenger. Story 67. Horrible. I was in high school. It was devastating. I think everyone was just shell-shocked. Story 68. It was absolutely horrible. They did not speak to us, offer an explanation, or allow us to go home. They rushed to turn off the television in our classroom. The teachers huddled outside for a while, and then we went on with our day. In a very real sense, many of my childhood illusions were shattered that day. Story 69. Watched it live in science class. We all needed a moment. Story 70. Shocked beyond belief. I was a senior at the time. One of the astronauts was an alumnus of my college. Story 71. I was in my late teens, but I did not witness it. It happened at 3 a.m. local time, so I did not learn about the disaster until I woke up. Remember, this was the mid-1980s with no internet, no streaming, and no 24-hour television. Even if I had been able to watch, I probably would not have stayed up. The flight only became famous after the disaster. Story 72. On the scale of things that completely messed my generation up, everyone having a core memory of some kind of in-school viewing of the Challenger launch, in our case wheeling in one of those big televisions. Seatbelted to an audiovisual cart because every school was so inspired by the fact that there was a teacher on board, only to have the thing literally explode in front of our eyes, is pretty high up there. I do not know how long we all stared at the screen after the explosion, but it felt like a long time before the television got turned off and wheeled away. Nobody expected anything like that could happen with the shuttles. They were new, they were modern, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration knew what it was doing. Manned spaceflight was really starting to become a normal thing to a lot of us. None of us kids had really ever seen the National Aeronautics and Space Administration fail at something, and the adults who had only saw anything like this almost 20 years prior with Apollo 1. Even on Apollo 13, everyone survived. American astronauts did not die on manned space missions. And then 7 did. In case you were wondering, no, we did not get trauma counseling or therapy or anything like that. The rest of that school day was pretty much a loss. I suspect the teachers were far more shaken in the immediate aftermath than most of us students, but we were right back to classwork the next day. Editor's note. As a New Yorker, I am going to say this probably had a deeper emotional impact on me than the September 11th, 2001 attacks did. We thought the September 11th attacks were a freak accident until the second plane hit. When that happened, we all realized it was an attack, but an attack on the World Trade Center was not unprecedented. We remembered the 1993 truck bomb. None of us expected the collapse, and watching that from the top floor of our college library was traumatic. But the idea of people destroying symbols of America did not seem as impossible as a 3-year-old space shuttle blowing up during launch, given everything else going on in the world at that time. Story 73. I was in elementary school and late that morning. We lived in Houston, but the shuttle's launch in Florida, I think. I remember believing I saw a shuttle explode in the sky, though that could not be true. By the time I reached school, the explosion had already happened. Memory is unreliable and sometimes invents details. The school had televisions and we were all going to watch because there was a teacher on board. I do not remember much of the day. The teachers seemed very sad, but the students did not appear upset. I did not really understand death then. I was in 4th or 5th grade and no one I knew had died. We had moved a lot, so I was used to losing friends with every move, and I suppose I treated that loss the same way. I think I felt indifferent, as if it did not matter. Story 74. Compared with the Challenger disaster, September 11th, 2001 was far worse and far more traumatic for the national psyche. Challenger was painful and pierced our Reagan-era sense of invulnerability, but it was a manageable tragedy. September 11th, 2001 was not, and it led directly to where the nation is now. Story 75. We had it on in the classroom. I remember it upset the teacher, but most of us were more awed by the explosion. We didn't really understand it. We were third graders. Story 76. It felt surreal and wasn't fully grasped until it became clear what had happened. The same feeling as during the John F. Kennedy assassination and the September 11th attacks. Story 77. I was a junior in high school. I remember walking down the hall to Mrs. Grainier's chemistry class, which was across from the library, and people were entering the library because it was the only room in the school with a television. Our teacher let us watch the launch because it was historic since Krista McAuliffe was on board. We saw the shuttle climb and then it just disappeared. We were not sure at first what we were seeing, but we realized something was very wrong when the solid rocket boosters were flying all over the place, which we had never seen before. Some people started crying and we walked back to class in shock. The rest of the day was a blur. I will never forget that feeling of being punched in the gut. Story 78. That was the first shuttle launch on which I provided payload support. I was outside on the 7th floor balcony of the Air Force Vertical Integration Building. My boss said it was such a clear day we should be able to see the solid rocket booster separate. A second later, we did. Shortly after, sirens went off and we were told to take cover, so we went back inside. They impounded all our documentation. Several months later, after determining the payload was not responsible, the documentation was returned to us. Story 79. I was a freshman in high school. Our earth sciences teacher was a runner-up, one of the top 3, in the competition that ultimately selected Krista McAuliffe as the finalist. The launch happened to overlap with our earth sciences period and Mr. Teacher was excited. He set up the television at the front of class. I sat in the second row behind a kid named Jim, who I was starting to be friends with, so we were always cracking jokes and getting in trouble. A long silence followed. Jim was the first to ask, "What happened?" Everyone looked at Mr. Teacher, already with tears in his eyes. He stood up, turned off the television, and told the class, "Please work on your homework for the remainder of the period. I will be back shortly." He left, and about 15 minutes later the vice principal came in and handled the last 5 minutes of class. Mr. Teacher was out for at least 2 weeks before he returned. I think that event permanently changed him. Story 80. I was in my late 20s. I had been following the National Aeronautics and Space Administration since the Redstone days. I turned on the television while making trades and saw it explode. Almost immediately, a friend called to make sure I had seen it. We watched the feed in silence. It made me feel completely empty. The flights had become almost commonplace, but that morning we were reminded how dangerous going into space can be. Story 81. Honestly, it did not mean a lot to me. Space travel was and is still risky. I was a university student by then. Story 82. In 4th grade, we used to watch all the shuttle launches live. My very mean teacher decided to punish us by not letting the class watch the launch. We all heard about it later from the classes that had good teachers. I resented Mrs. Freeber. Story 83. I was in high school. We watched it live in class. Everyone was shocked. The teacher's response was to turn the television off and say, "Okay, well, back to work." After that, I went home to an empty house and made myself a bologna sandwich. We did not have any potato chips. Just in case you are wondering why Generation X is so messed up. Story 84. After seeing Alan Shepard launch into space and everything that followed, the Challenger disaster felt like a massive punch in the gut. Story 85. I knew there was going to be a launch that day, but I'd seen several, so I didn't witness it. I walked into the lounge at my college and everyone was clustered around the television. I asked if it had launched and they told me it had exploded. I didn't believe them. I laughed and said, "Yeah, right?" Then I realized it was true. Story 86. I was in high school here in Florida. We all left class to watch it. It was awful to watch. Story 87. I imagine it felt a lot like witnessing September 11th for the next generation. Such an event hits you like a gut punch, and you are left wondering why as the shock finally fades. Story 88. I remember we watched it in high school, but I do not recall what happened afterward. Story 89. It was incredibly sad, yet black humor appeared quickly. The main joke was, What does the National Aeronautics and Space Administration stand for? Need another 7 astronauts. About a year later, I went to a bad taste party and someone was dressed as a National Aeronautics and Space Administration astronaut, wearing a spacesuit with many burn marks. Story 90. I would have been 8, which would be 3rd grade. I have no memory of watching it at school. I am not sure whether I simply did not remember it or could not process what had happened. I was probably thinking about Transformers or Government Issue Joe while it happened. Story 91. I was a kid, so my memories are not the best, but I remember a lot of sadness and confusion. I also remember a Punky Brewster episode about it. It was heavy. Story 92. I was 18 watching it live during my first semester of college. The volume was off because we were in class, but they kept the picture on for us. I was absolutely stunned afterward. They canceled classes. Story 93. I was in 1st grade, and they wheeled a television into our library so all the students could watch. When it blew up, some kids were laughing because we did not know what was happening. Some teachers were crying, and it was just strange because we were all rushed out. I did not fully grasp what had happened for a few years. Story 94. I was at a bar having an early lunch, watching the television with the sound turned down. Back then, they did not have big screens, just a large television mounted above the bar. I watched the liftoff. Another man and I were watching while everyone else was busy. I saw it happen and wondered if it was real. I asked the bartender to turn up the volume. He was not happy because he was busy with food and drink orders, but the other man said it was a disaster, so the bartender looked up and hurried to turn it up. The bar fell silent. There was not much to say. Bizarrely, jokes about it started within a week. I do not know what is wrong with people who do that kind of thing. Story 95. The first thing I remember is that it was one of the first shuttle launches I did not watch on television among those I could have watched. My brother came to tell me. I felt terrible. I was a big fan of Jean-Michel Jarre's album dedicated to the crew. It was originally meant to feature music to be performed in space during that mission. Story 96. My 2nd grade teacher, Ms. Marshall, turned off the television and all the kids in my class were in tears. No one could understand what happened. Story 97. I watched it with my parents. They were very emotional and upset. Story 98. When Krista McAuliffe, who seemed to me to have won the lottery by being chosen for the mission, died in a tragic accident, it was heartbreaking. Story 99. I was in elementary school. We gathered in the auditorium to watch the launch. It was a big deal for all the schools because a teacher was going into space. When it exploded, there was shock and silence, and then some teachers and students began to cry. It was tragic. Story 100. I was very young, but what I remember most vividly is the despair on my father's face as we watched the news together. I had never seen him look like that. He did not answer when I asked questions. Story 101. The news played it repeatedly. Each time you hoped it would turn out differently. Senna's death felt the same, watching the screen and hoping he would make that corner long after he was clearly gone. Story 102. I was in 3rd grade. The teachers rolled a television in on a metal cart, a huge, heavy cathode ray tube television. 2 other classes joined us, and we knew from the news that a teacher was going to go into space with the astronauts. Then it happened, and we were all confused about what was going on. 70 or so 9-year-olds looked to our teachers for an explanation, and some of them were crying. One of the teachers turned the television to the news, and we were ushered out into the cold for recess. It did not sink in until much later what had happened, and as a little kid I knew what I had seen was bad from the adults' reactions, but it was all just so confusing. Story 103. It was my mom's birthday. I was in middle school, and the whole school was in an assembly to watch it take off, which was a little disturbing for a couple hundred kids to see live. Story 104. I did not take it as hard as the Oklahoma City bombing at a child care facility by Timothy McVeigh. These victims knew the risks. Story 105. I was very confused when I watched it live in elementary school. Story 106. It was very unfortunate. I felt sorry for the families of the astronauts who died. As usual, another tragedy that could have been prevented. People need to pay attention. Story 107. I was very young when I watched the launch with my parents. The shuttle and its rocket exploded, and I did not fully understand what I was seeing. My parents gasped and shouted no, and I realized something was very wrong. Story 108. I was in high school in the United Kingdom. I do not recall watching it live. It would have been quite late at night for us, but reading the newspaper the next day was awful. Then the joke started, and it felt so wrong. Story 109. I was homesick that day and watching television when it exploded. I was very confused. My mother came into the room and turned it off. She told me there had been an accident and that the teacher had not survived. Story 110. As an engineer, it was horrible to know they should never have launched that day. Story 111. I was in middle school. I did not believe it. I kept thinking there had to be some way they could have survived. Story 112. We were in school when they took us to the library to watch the launch. We were too young to fully comprehend the gravity of what had happened. We knew it was tragic but did not process it the way the adults did. We were in our early teens. Story 113. I live in Alaska and would wake up for every shuttle launch when they were broadcast on cable news network. The shock I felt at 7 a.m. is something I will never forget. I remember seeing the leak on the booster in the replay. The other booster's trail and explosion are embedded in my mind. Story 114. I am not old enough, but my mother tells this story all the time. She has always been very interested in the National Aeronautics and Space Administration and in space. She partied too hard during her first year of college and learned she was being placed on academic probation the same day a rocket story broke. When she called her mother crying, her mother assumed the call was about the rocket, but my mother had not heard the news yet and was just upset about school. Story 115. I saw it in middle school live during math class with about 30 other students. The teacher turned off the television right after it happened and wheeled it out of the room. We all sat in silence for a couple of minutes. For a while, I thought the fuel tanks had just exploded and that it was supposed to happen. Story 116. I was in high school at the time. We were in yearbook, the class in charge of the publication, and our instructor was really cool and let us watch television. We watched the whole thing happen. Then the bell rang and we went about our day. It was kind of surreal. Story 117. I was in high school in a very rural area at the time. Our redneck principal made an announcement over the public address system to the entire school. The space shuttle has blown up. It exploded. I can't tell you what a weird burden it is to carry that my primary memory of this tragic, historic event is of that ignorant man running his mouth. My dad was a pilot at the time, as were many other fathers. We lived near an Air Force base, so there was a dark cloud for a while. Lots of hushed conversations among the adults, and a few of the men even knew some of the astronauts. Story 118. It was an unforgettable day, that was for sure. I still remember walking to the store to buy bread, ham, and cheese for brunch. I was just a kid at the time. I spent a moment watching the news on the store's small television, then ran home like a maniac to tell my dad, only to find him already glued to it, seething with anger and shock before I even walked into the house. Story 119. I was young and we watched it live in my elementary school. We did not understand what was happening, but from the teachers we knew it was something very bad. Looking back, it was the first in a series of awful public moments. I remember listening to the O.J. Simpson verdict in junior high and watching the second plane hit before leaving for class in my second year of college. Story 120. It was surreal. I was in 6th grade and, by coincidence, had a half day of school, so I got home just in time to watch the launch. I sat on the living room floor while my mother sat on the couch behind me talking to her best friend. The shuttle rose and then exploded. Hey, Mom! I think the shuttle exploded. Oh shit, Dawn. I'll call you back. We spent the next few hours glued to the television. It was eerie hearing the National Aeronautics and Space Administration count mission time for a few seconds and then announce a major malfunction. We watched a large chunk of wreckage fall to the ground, listened to reporters and experts speculate about escape pods, saw the same footage replayed, and heard people talking with almost no information, trying to fill the dead air. Story 121. I remember there were a couple of teachers in the room with a TV someone had brought in. It got quiet as everyone tried to wrap their heads around what they had just witnessed. If I recall correctly, the principal came in and made a short statement to comfort us. I remember it appearing in every newspaper for a while. There were follow-up stories that provided more information about the crash. It was all over the news. I did not learn until much later that there was evidence they had been conscious during at least the initial part of the crash. Story 122. I was a bit too young to really understand it at the time. However, the loss of the Space Shuttle Columbia was an entirely different matter. Story 123. I am an engineer and was working at my first job after college. I was packed into a room with about 20 engineering nerds who were like giddy children waiting for Santa. Everyone watched in disbelief and said nothing. No one got much done that day. Story 124. In fourth grade, we saw it on the television. They rolled a large card in. It exploded, and the teacher quickly rolled the television out. Then we had recess. Story 125. It was strange. It was not clear at first what was happening. My junior high school science teacher had carted a television into the classroom for us to watch, then carted it right back out after the explosion. We knew we were supposed to feel sad, but we did not know any of those people. I had read a few articles about Krista McAuliffe and seen her interview on television, so I knew it was sad that she was the first regular person chosen to go to space and that she died during the launch. That was when I really learned what irony meant. I had heard the word before but did not understand it from the context in which I had heard it. This was definitely ironic and darkly so. Many of my classmates, mostly the pick-me kids, were performative about their grief for a few days, which made it feel even more surreal. I felt I should have been more upset than I was, but I was not sure why. I never looked at the space program the same way again. I had much more respect for it. Story 126. I was 8. Felt strange. Everyone was very quiet. I was ashamed to admit it. When I got home from school, I was upset because it was on every channel, and I missed my cartoons. Mind you, we only had 3 channels. Story 127. I was in 3rd grade. The entire class went quiet when it happened. I remember being extremely distraught. Some kids said they might still be alive, but even at that young age I knew there was no way. Story 128. While I am not going to knock individual accounts, this is a tricky subject because our memories are unreliable. The Wall Street Journal has a great article titled "When Our Memories Are Both Vivid and Wrong About This Event." More specifically, the day after the shuttle explosion, students at Emory University were asked to write down their recollections of the disaster. They were asked to do the same thing again nearly 3 years later. In most cases, the later versions differed significantly from the earlier ones. One student, for example, said the day after that she had first learned of the tragedy while watching television in her dorm room. 2 years later she remembered, just as vividly, that she had heard about it in her religion class and had then gone back to the dorm to watch television. Research has shown that despite the malleability of flashbulb memories, people are generally very confident that their recall of such events is completely accurate. Story 129. Worst day ever. Instead of my 2nd grade class celebrating my birthday after watching the teacher go to space, we watched the news video repeatedly. I might have been too young to fully comprehend it at the time. Story 130. It felt the same when I was watching the news and saw a jet fly into the first tower in New York City. I then watched a second jet hit the second tower live. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.